Hello, Thrivers! Today we're going to talk about boundaries. Words like boundaries or limits seem to carry a negative connotation. Ironically, boundaries actually empower us to go so much farther rather than limiting us. Boundaries stop us from spinning out of control. Many of us are spinning out of control. Me personally, not so long ago, I felt like I was on this gyroscope that was moving at a frantic speed and I could not get up. I had no choice but just to keep spinning and keep moving with this gyroscope. I was so overwhelmed. I was constantly depleted. Sometimes I would wake up in the morning and feel completely wiped. And I'm thinking, I literally just woke up. So why am I this tired? At a point I became ineffective because I stretched myself so thin, so I couldn't be any good to anybody, not even myself. I had these migraines that would last for days, sometimes even up to over a week. Man, one day I thought to myself, this is no life. I decided to stop and take stock of my life. And when I did this, I started to realize all the ways that I pushed myself way too far. And this is what happens when we don't establish boundaries in our lives. However, today, I'm not going to talk to you about establishing boundaries. Today, we are going to discuss how to recognize boundaries. Specifically, how to recognize the boundaries that God has put in place to help us flourish and live more effectively, and how to align our lives to be in accordance with these boundaries. Today's topic is part of a new series that I started last week, where we are exploring God's blueprint for a thriving life. Last week, we discussed how recognizing and giving God his rightful place as creator and controller of all things is crucial to pursuing a life of flourishing and fulfillment. We also explored tendencies we often resort to that hamper our ability to properly apply this principle to our lives. If you missed that episode, then you should definitely check it out using the link in the description. But for today, we're going to spend some time exploring a portion of the creation narrative to gain a deeper understanding of God's heart and vision for the role of boundaries in our lives. Second, we will discuss some of the reasons why it is so important for us to live in accordance with God's boundaries. Here we will unearth realities that we each contend with every day but don't often pay enough attention to. And at the end of our discussion, I'm going to share with you one aspect of life where many of us are so prone to disregarding God's boundaries. And because it's become commonplace among many of us, we've somehow normalized it and even normalized many of the negative consequences that this disregard introduces into our lives. You're going to want to hear what I have to share, because I'm going to speak from personal experience and I'm going to share with you how becoming more cognizant of this area of frequent disregard changed the way that I approach life and truly revolutionized many aspects of my life. As mentioned earlier, we will start our discussion by exploring a portion of the creation narrative to understand God's vision for boundaries. We will be exploring Genesis chapter 1 verse 2. And in this passage, right after the author of the book of Genesis tells us that God made the heavens and the earth in 1 verse 1, he then goes on in verse 2 to describe the state of the earth before God began his creative work. And so in this passage, in Genesis chapter 1 verse 2, the passage reads, "The earth was formless and empty, and darkness covered the deep waters. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters." This is Genesis 1 verse 2 from the NIV Bible version. Essentially, from this passage, the author is telling us the earth was an uninhabited wasteland overrun by chaotic waters. The author then explains how God set about transforming this wasteland through his creative activities. First, God gave it a facelift by driving up the dark place. Then he methodically organized and structured the chaotic waters that overrun the place. He created the sky to separate the water. Some parts contained above the sky and some below. And then he further organized the water below the sky and marked out its limits to create dry land. And all of this is found in the first 10 verses of Genesis chapter 1. Why did the author of the book of Genesis feel the need to provide these many details about what God did with the chaotic waters? He did this to drive home the point that the earth was a chaotic mess, and God brought order to this mess by organizing it and setting its boundaries. That is why in the book of Revelation, where John describes a revelation he received from God about events that will take place in the future, he explains that there will be a recreation of a new heaven and a new earth, and there won't be any more seas. The passage says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth. For the first heaven and the first earth passed away, and there was no longer any sea." Revelation 21 verse 1. In the past, I wondered what the sea had to do with anything. But then, eventually I learned that it is about what the sea represents in this narrative. And in this narrative, the sea represents chaos. So here in Genesis, when you read so much about how God structured the water, the author is implying that God put structure and ordered the chaotic mess of a wasteland to create the earth we now inhabit. God contained the waters, gave them their proper place, and set their limits. If you recall the story of the flood in the days of Noah, God actually reversed this action. He let the chaotic waters overrun the earth and submerge the earth, stifling every form of life that existed on earth, except for the ones that God preserved in Noah's Ark. The point is this: God's boundaries and limitations ordered chaos and created an environment that would support life of every kind. Without his boundaries, the earth would be uninhabitable. God's heart and design for boundaries is actually to enliven us. When we are fully alive, then we can be effective in our various callings and spheres of influence. However, respecting and living in alignment with God's boundaries, as well sovereign as they are, is not quite as easy for us. In fact, sometimes it can be near impossible. Why? There are various reasons, actually two main reasons that contribute to this. The first one is simple and plain: the devil. Whether we realize it or not, Satan's activity in our world today is real. For one, Satan often tries to make us believe that God's boundaries are to restrain us and stop us from enjoying something that would make our lives better. We see this in Genesis chapter 3 in the conversation between the serpent, representing Satan, and the first humans. We also see it in the activity of the Antichrist, whom Paul describes in the book of Thessalonians, who also advances Satan's agenda. Paul refers to him as the man of lawlessness, and we can read about this in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 from verse 1 to 12. In this passage, Apostle Paul explains that one of the activities of this man of lawlessness is to spread deception. He has no regard for God's order, so he uses deceit to introduce confusion and chaos. Paul goes on to explain that the people who fall for this deception are people who have already refused to accept God's truth. And this brings me to the second reason why it is so difficult to live in adherence to God's boundary. One of the implications of our corrupted human nature due to sin is the proclivity to live and act in opposition to God. Our knee-jerk reaction is always to act in ways that are contrary to God's design. So in this passage that I'm referencing in 2 Thessalonians, Paul is then explaining that the people who fall for the deception of this Antichrist, this man of lawlessness, have already decided to defy God's established boundaries in the first place, and therefore they become gullible when Satan, who has no regard for God's laws and God's boundaries, presents them with an idea. The idea sounds very good to them because it is consistent with what they already want to do. James conveys the same thought when he explains that we become tempted because of our proclivity to rebel against God's established order. And when we act in accordance with this proclivity, it becomes sin. Sin is a very definition of failure to live up to God's design, failure to live up to God's boundaries, really. It is defying or violating God's boundaries and God's design. The sobering reality is this: just like we have the natural inclination to usurp God's place, like we discussed last week in the previous episode in this series, totally aligned to this tendency, we also are prone to disregard God's established order and establish our own instead. Because we are already naturally inclined to defy God's design, we are then readily receptive to the devil's deception, because he too has no regard for God's order. So he exploits what is already inside of us and draws it out. Not that we need much help in that way anyway, because even without the devil's influence, we often act in ways that are consistent with our natural proclivities. So here we see the devil is at work, but we are also culpable because God has given us the ability to exercise choice. We don't have to engage. Jesus didn't. When the devil tried to tempt him, Jesus called the devil out on his deceit. That is why the Bible says that Jesus was tempted in every way, just like we are, yet he did not sin. He exercised his choice not to give in to the devil's deception. We sin when we choose to give in to the temptation, and that is why we are culpable. So based on our discussion so far, there are 4 realities that we need to be cognizant of that is constantly warring against us. 1, we are perpetually prone to disregarding God's established boundaries and establishing our own instead. 2, the devil and his activities in our lives and in the world, which is to introduce chaos into God's order or will. But he succeeds because we choose to participate in his agenda. 3, God has granted us the implicit ability to exercise choice. This includes the choice to give into our proclivity and also to participate in the devil's plot. 4, without God's structure, all there is chaos. That is what the author of the book of Genesis was trying to convey to us with his detailed explanation of how God separated the chaotic waters. So whenever we defy or disregard God's established structure, we invariably introduce chaos. It's not punitive, it's not a punishment for something, it's just a natural byproduct. Hence, the summary of it all is this: on one hand, we are powerful. God has endowed us with the ability to make things happen by exercising our choice. However, this ability is also limited, and the quality of what it can produce is dependent on how well it aligns with God's vision. And therein lies weakness. And unfortunately, we don't necessarily like to be aligned with God. We don't like being limited in any way. We don't like someone telling us this is how things should be. I hate to say, we like lawlessness. We would rather do as we please, do what makes us happy, do what feels right. Human tendencies that has become a reality for us. So where does this all leave us? It leaves us contending with both a strength and a weakness. I'm sure at this point you can think of quite a number of instances of how this plays out in our world, in your life, and in our world as a whole. Feel free to share your comments, and I'd like to hear your thoughts. And as promised, I do want to highlight one area of our life where God's boundaries are so easily and incessantly defied. And I bring up this illustration because it is subtle and one that does not easily come to mind when we think about ways that we defy God's boundaries. In fact, we have somehow blurred the boundary lines so that it is no longer visible. And I'm talking about the treatment of our physical bodies. You know, I stumbled upon an article some time ago on sleep education. According to this article, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention reported that 1 out of 3 Americans are sleep deprived. Personally, I don't even need any study to show me that. If I just look at myself, look at my friends, look at my colleagues, look at my family members, the evidence is clear. I'm sure it's the same for you too. This article also explains that part of the reason for this is that our society seems to reward those who stay up working or socializing rather than sleeping. So being sleep deprived is some kind of badge of honor. It conveys some idea of productivity and even gives us some air of being important or being relevant. You might have heard people make comments like, I'll rest when I die. The idea of rest and sleep pushes against our drive to produce and build our skyscrapers and stay on and never turn off. There's this whole idea that if I turn off for a minute, life will move on without me and I'll be left behind. Obviously, this level of activity is not sustainable, at least for the average person. I don't doubt that there are ninjas among us, but most of us aren't. But we want to be. So we design substances and resources to help us continue to exist at this frantic pace, but it's not without a cost though. Mental health issues such as anxiety and depression are on the rise, and this creates a whole new set of problems of their own. Physically, spiritually, and socially, there are all kinds of problems tied. We are awake and active, but not fully alive. But some part of our personhood is effaced because you're not 100% yourself when you're under duress or under the influence of something else. This is the direct opposite of wholeness. It is utter chaos. I'm not saying that sleep deprivation is the ultimate source of all of our disasters. Basically, that our entire existence is all about defying God's boundaries. So there are quite a number of contributing factors, but when you trace them all, they are rooted in failure to live up to God's design. I just wanted to use our disregard of our body's need for rest as an illustration, partly because it is not one that would easily come to mind. And you know what? God is so gracious, He typically gives us warning signs to alert us that a boundary is being violated. But we still ignore these warning signs the way we ignore the check engine light in our car, in my case anyway. One day, we get into the car and it just won't go. Or you may be driving on the highway and without warning, your car starts spinning, swerving all over the place. The car starts malfunctioning and even becomes hazardous because the warning signs were ignored. You know what? We don't just ignore the warning signs, we normalize them. We somehow turn them into a normal aspect of our life. We normalize our dysfunctions and therefore live less than the life that God envisioned for us. At least that's what I did for years. Here's a little bit of confession. I'm a bit of an overachiever. And so when there's a goal in front of me, I can't stop until it is accomplished. A goal in front of me is a natural high. I don't even need coffee, I don't need energy drinks. I'm just gonna stay up until it's done. So because I can withstand prolonged pressure, I typically would just keep going. And I would complete the project. I would achieve the goal, but then I would fall sick. I would have these migraines that would last up to a week. At some point, even past a week. At some point in my life, I realized I was having migraines all the time. My doctor even ordered an MRI just to make sure that everything was well in my head, my brain was. So then eventually my doctor suggested that perhaps she should prescribe a medicine that I have to take every day rather than one that I take when needed. And somehow this suggestion kind of scared me. The idea of having to depend on medicine that you have to take every single day was just a little scary for me. And so I decided, okay, I think I'm going to try to look through some other remedies before I actually finally resort to this. And so at this point, I stepped off that gyroscope I alluded to at the beginning of our discussion today. And that's just it. If you're waiting for the gyroscope to stop for you to get off, you will not get off. You are gonna have to jump off the gyroscope to take hold of your life. Anyway, I started seriously evaluating my habits and tendencies, which then led to several lifestyle changes. And one of the major habits I introduced is having a consistent sleep schedule. Hence why I brought it up as an example in our discussion today. I discovered my circadian rhythm and realized the optimum amount of sleep my body needs every night. And so I made sure I allowed the time to be able to get this amount of rest that I believe my body needed. to be able to recharge. And one of my problems too with my migraines is that the jolt of alarms will typically trigger it. And so I did away with the alarms, which then meant that I had to go to bed in a good time in order to wake up early enough naturally to start my day. Through these careful and meticulous changes that were difficult, but that I was able to, over time, incorporate, my migraines reduced greatly. And now several aspects of my life actually changed. And so it was only in the process of time that I looked back and I realized my migraines are God's check engine light. Because like I said, I wouldn't stop. I would just keep going and going and going because I didn't really have boundaries. But God in His mercy, I was realizing, was using migraines to help me, to warn me that I'm violating my body's need to rest. I was letting my pursuits determine my schedule and my habits. But no, God created me as a creative agent with the capability to exert control over my life. And He wanted me to exercise this capability. It turns out God's limitation was not to limit me, but to empower me to fully exude the capacity He has invested in me and to fully be alive. So how about you? Are there boundary issues God has led you to address in your life? What was your experience with it and what has been the outcome so far? I'd love to hear your thoughts. So be sure to leave me a comment and let me know. Or perhaps you're in a place where you're thinking, my life needs better stewardship. And notice I use the word stewardship. I prefer calling it stewarding our lives over controlling. So if you're thinking, well, I think my life might benefit from better stewardship, then you may need to think through, are there boundaries that you have defied all this while that need to be reinstated in your life? Are there warning signs that you perhaps need to stop ignoring? Or perhaps you have not even paid enough attention to note those warning signs for what they are. And hopefully, inspired by our discussion today, you can become more cognitive and attentive to God-designed warning signs in your life. But always remember this, the chaos and fragmentation that we experience by defying God's established boundaries are not punitive, but just natural result of destroying order. Get this order. On the other hand, God's boundaries are always to empower us to fully become all that He designed us to be, and not to limit what He feels who we are. Thank you for joining me today. Join me again next week as we continue to explore God's blueprint for a thriving life. If you enjoyed our discussion today, please subscribe to our channel and hit the thumbs up icon. Again, thank you for joining me and see you in the next episode. Take care.